in defense of buffet metaphysics. The consensus on living things promoted by those who think about the topic, and repeated by those who mostly avoid thinking, is that there is a meaningful delineation between the forms that can be considered alive and those that should be considered inanimate. This perspective is flawed. The difference between the simplest form accepted to be alive and the most complex form that is considered inanimate is less than the variation across the spectrum of living things. It is a more logically coherent perspective to forego the insistence on a hard line and adopt the perspective that allows for a spectrum of being, a spectrum that begins with the simplest form and continues up to and beyond the human. It should not be controversial to describe the individual as a sequence of experiences, whereas the monist is seeking to describe a mode of experience that persists beyond body identification. Physicalists perform impressive feats of mental gymnastics to deny the very reality of subjective states. Although it is gauche to ascribe psychological motives to strangers, I honestly believe that the physicalist's impetus for denying the individual is to be absolved of personal responsibility. The individual is a sequence of experiences. The sequence is different in every case. The individual is self-referential. Therefore, the quality of individual experience is unique and becomes ever more so. The unique quality of individual experience is the source of indeterminacy in the physical world. Even when all the attachments to the physical are removed, and all that remains is attention itself, the individual sequence persists. This is evidenced by the fact that experience of pure awareness is followed by a return to an individual sequence and perspective. The materialist perspective envisions the highly abstract concept of physical laws as the thing underpinning the regularity in nature. When we allow for individuals existing all the way down the levels of form, the regularity need not be attributed to repeating chains of blind interactions governed by law. Rather, the regular expressions of form are evidence of common structures of perception. It is because the experiences of the cells of one oak leaf are analogous to the experiences of the cells of an oak leaf on the other side of the world that the two leaves are alike. This phenomenon of shared experience for separate individuals can be described by likening the individual to a segment of holographic film. The segment provides a limited perspective on the whole that applies irrespective of physical location. The holographic analogy is useful for understanding linkages between individuals that can be thought of as shared structures of perception. It is a view on the connectedness of all things suited to the human perspective. It is also possible to appreciate how the linkages might appear from the highest perspective. Think about what happens when two physically separate humans move closer together. The actions required are ideas that begin at the level of the human mind and ripple through the forms of the body and out into the forms beyond. The ideas are limited, and so the process is a series of steps. Now try to imagine the highest perspective. At this level, thought is complete. There is no number of steps separating it from anything else. From such a perspective, all individuals are laid on top of each other. The experiences of a given individual could appear as a mandala, superimposed on all others. From the highest perspective, the common structures of experience can be envisioned as a mandala formed by the layering of all individuals. In describing reality, the panpsychist perspective is useful, the unique individual mind is useful, and a Platonic type conception of shared perception is also useful. The mix of shared structures and individual perspectives distributes idealism across the many instances. Whereas the material perspective fails to account for minds, this buffet perspective makes them the building block of existence. A reality composed of individual minds underpinned by shared structures of perception is not enough to describe existence. Every level of mind requires elements of shared perception. No matter how high up we go, a pre-existing landscape of perception is needed. For individual minds to exist, there is a need for a different type of mind. The concept of the monad is useful. Something exists relative to the total of all minds. The concept of emanation solves the problem of correspondence across levels of mind. However, the idea that nothing can be said about the nature of the one is misguided. At the very least, the existence of uniquely structured individuals is permitted. Even the insistence that the individual is a delusion requires admitting that the delusion is permitted. And, within the permitted delusion, there are harmonies. The harmonies in the physical emanate from the highest. The double-slit experiment has achieved cult status in popular culture. Many worldviews rich in positivity and bereft of logical coherence rest upon the interpretation of the experiment where the photon passes through both slits. This interpretation and the concept of wave-particle duality are not the most coherent explanation for what is observed. By considering the role of unique individuals operating via shared structures of perception, a different interpretation presents itself. Individuals represent a unique structure of experience. The unique quality of experience ensures that, from the perspective of wider existence, the way a given individual will change cannot be known in advance. The individual experience rests upon shared elements of perception, so there is a range of potential expressions that exist. Even if one is uncomfortable with the concept of individual minds extending all the way down to the simplest forms, the very fact that there are some individuals with uniquely structured experiences in the system ensures that indeterminacy exists throughout the whole. Imagine a rifle that is pointed in a fixed direction, then think about a line representing the path a bullet will travel from the gun. This path exists before the bullet is fired. Now imagine that the rifle is able to move in a limited set of directions. The path that bullets might travel is now a set of lines or a field of potential. The same concept of fields of potential can be applied to the double-slit experiment. What the experiment terms a photon, some would understand as a vibration or a perturbation. From the perspective of individuals, the most useful way to think of it is as a symbol or a single unit of meaning. In any case, the direction that the photon will travel is not determined in advance. It exists relative to a defined field that can be thought of as a consensus of potentials. The wavelength is the potential paths that the single unit can take. When there are two appropriately spaced slits, the single unit does not travel through both. What is described as interference caused by the single unit is better understood as a change in the field of potential. It is possible for the single unit to travel through either slit. The new pattern demonstrates that a new consensus of potentials is generated. The interference occurs before the photon is even fired. Setting up the detection device on one slit changes the field of potential again. This subtly different interpretation has significant ramifications for how existence is viewed. The conventional interpretation of wave-particle duality led many intellectually lazy individuals to claim that consciousness was creating reality. All existence was a soup of frequencies waiting for them, and possibly a small number of other genuine creator beings to bring it into existence. The highly solipsistic nature of this interpretation is so pernicious that one wonders if this was the reason the idea of wave-particle duality was promoted in the first place. It is not the very special nature of the human mind that creates existence. The consensus of potentials is a product of all minds operating via the shared structures that underpin all levels of perception. The interpretation that allows for a defined structure of potential has a greater explanatory value. It is a perspective that describes the linkage between the limits of physical form and existence beyond. The individual experiences conscious existence via the forms of the body, but the body is not the only realm of experience. The individual also experiences potentials that are not defined by the body. One can dream, one can imagine, and one can have extrasensory perceptions. This is to say that the individual has access to the potential adjacent to the physical. This perspective can be termed supraconscious awareness. Supraconscious awareness is limited by the scope of the individual, and we can only imagine combinations of experiences conceptually adjacent to our personal configuration. The potential to which an individual has access extends out into possibilities that cannot be comprehended by a given mind. Psychological language conflates the unconscious with the unconsidered and describes past conscious experiences that have been forgotten as unconscious. The proper definition of unconsciousness is the total of experiences beyond the scope of a given mind. The conscious, supraconscious, and unconscious regions of potential can be equated to the physical, the astral, and the void. The buffet perspective on metaphysics leads to a superior interpretation for how information propagates through reality. The view combines individual minds, shared structures of perception, a regulatory function of the highest mind, and the continuation of existence from the physical into potential. Given that uniquely structured minds collectively form the shared structure, it is necessary to conceive of shared elements of perception as distinct from the standard Platonic perspective. Unique minds are in flux, so distinct regions of shared perception, such as the human experience, are changing. As the shared structure is continual across levels of mind, the whole is in flux. From the highest perspective, where all potentials are accounted for, it might be coherent to view existence as complete. From the perspective of limited minds, though, the structure that informs existence is fluid, and it makes more sense to think in terms of a continually evolving realm of information. The observation that the shared structure is evolving allows the conceptual space for another element to be added to the buffet perspective. The concept of the egregore, or thought form, is a useful way of envisioning the emergence of dominant patterns in regions of the shared structure. Repeatedly paying attention along the same lines leads to patterns of individual thought. Such patterns facilitate attention. What applies to the individual applies to the shared structure, and egregores are patterns of shared perception. The patterns exist fractally through scales of analysis. There are egregores that exist at the scale of all humans, at the scale of specific races, and at the scale of towns, and at the scale of small groups. To find oneself playing an unfamiliar role within a friendship group requires the existence of latent individual tendencies and a specific structure of the egregore created by the group to bring them forth. The shared structure facilitates an understanding of how idealism is distributed across individuals. The egregore describes specific patterns or regions of shared thought. This line of thinking leads us to other useful concepts deserving of consideration in a buffet metaphysical worldview. Individuals are collectively forming shared structures of perception. If we consider elements of our world to be aberrations or deviations from the good, then we are pointing to deficiencies in the individuals here. There is utility to the concept of a fallen world. When we invoke the concept, we point at ourselves. There is utility to a metaphorical interpretation of original sin as describing the propensity for human beings to contribute to perpetuating the fallen world. Having acknowledged the existence and development of egregores, we might observe that the number of distinct patterns of thought are lessening in the modern world. The ascendance of technology is the synthesis and consolidation of egregores. Homogeneous systems become sclerotic and vulnerable to outside forces. Perhaps the idea of a reset, or cycles of creation and destruction, deserve a place in the buffet perspective. A buffet perspective on metaphysics is more holistic than a perspective that requires thinking of oneself as an adherent to any branch or school. It allows for what works and admits any puzzle piece that fits.